You're listening to episode 328 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Alex Kakuyo joins us to speak about Perfectly Ordinary, Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. There can be tremendous allure to leading the monastic life, relinquishing worldly possessions, and fully immersing in learning and practice. But sometimes during this very different way of living one's life, another realization occurs. Zen is not separate from life, even the householder's life. Sensei Alex Kakuyo is a former Marine, author, and Buddhist teacher with a BA in philosophy from Wabash College. Alex's journey into Buddhism began when he had a quarter-life crisis in January 2013. At this point, he possessed everything he thought would make him happy: fast car, money, job success, but still went to bed feeling miserable each night. Convinced that there had to be more to life than simply earning a paycheck, he began studying spirituality, which led him to the teachings of the Buddha. After reading the Four Noble Truths, Alex knew that he'd found his path. In May 2018, he was authorized to teach in the tradition of Reverend Koyo Kubose. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Darjeeling tea. Our guest today is Alex Kakuyo. Alex, welcome to the podcast. So glad to be speaking with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Very glad to have you here. And, in doing a little bit of the preparatory research for this episode, there are a few things that really stood out for me on your Same Old Zen blog. And for those listening, I'll be linking to that on the episode page. I'll mention that again later. But really an interesting part of your story, normally I ask, tell us about your background, but I really want you to tell your story because that seems to weave into some of the themes I want to just explore with you today. So tell us about the story of Alex and Buddhism.
Sure, absolutely. So I always tell people I got into Buddhism completely by accident. Essentially, I was always a very goal-driven kid, type A personality. So went to school, got good grades, went to college, got good grades, enlisted in the Marines, left the Marines, got a job, and, just kind of lived that life, working my way up the corporate ladder. And I ended up getting my dream job in the tech sector, working as a business analyst. And I basically had accomplished everything that I thought or had been told I needed to accomplish in order to, to be happy, to be content. I'd earned all the gold stars at that point.
Yeah.
And I was just waiting for something to click. Not sure exactly what I was looking for, a pat on the head, a trophy, but I felt like something was supposed to happen. And obviously that didn't. And a real sense of misery started to set in as a result. And it was really interesting because, again, I had all of the material stuff, the nice apartment, the good job, the fast car, and it just wasn't happening for me. So my mental state got worse and worse. And kind of out of desperation, I went to the library and I started looking into spirituality. And when I first did that, I got every book except the ones on Buddhism. And there wasn't any real thought or reason behind that. It just kind of wasn't on my radar at that point. And I was experimenting with lots of different practices. None of them really resonated with me. And then completely by chance, I learned about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is the leader of one of the Vajrayana schools of Buddhism. And, um, and just learning about that and learning about his experiences having to live in exile and, the annexation of Tibet by the Chinese. And I was just really inspired by his example, because here was a man, like, if anyone had the right to be angry and hateful towards the world, it's him, right? Losing his homeland, his friends and family being killed. And I think, looking back, I didn't think about it this way at the time, but I think that really resonated with me as an African American and with the lineage of, slavery and civil rights here in the United States as well. So then I got all the books on Buddhism and I was reading those, and it was really working for me. I could tell there was something here. So that's when I did a quick Google search and realized there was a temple near my house, the Kwan School of Zen, which is a Korean Zen tradition. So I started practicing there with Pope Link Rhodes. And again, it was great. I learned a lot of really great things from him. I learned a lot of great things from the practice. But then what ended up happening is there was a tension there. And I think it's a tension that all householder Buddhists have, where, I go to this temple and I'm doing offerings and I'm doing 108 prostrations. But then I go back to my job and people are screaming at each other at the conference table, right? So I just didn't know how to integrate those two things. And I felt like I had to choose. I could practice Buddhism or I could be a householder. And what ended up happening is that monasticism wasn't an option at that point, because I had student loans that needed to be paid, a family that would not be happy with me if I, disappeared into a monastery. So the kind of halfway point I found was to live and work on organic farms and then continue my Buddhist practice that way. So I did that for about 8 months. So I was in Indiana, I was in New York, built tiny houses, planted fruit trees, and I spent a lot of time in meditation. And it again was really good. But I realized from that experience that I could not escape worldly problems. Some of the same issues I'd experienced in the boardroom, I was also experiencing on the farm. People are people anywhere you go. So at that point, I decided I needed to do something else and figure out how to integrate these two things. And that's when I found my current teacher, Reverend Koyo Kubose. He's an ordained Pure Land Buddhist minister, and his practice is largely focused on integrating everyday life with spirituality, which was really powerful for me. Just learning. So, for example, he teaches something called toilet gasho, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of a ritual that you perform, every morning while you're doing your business. But it just reminds you that, you have running water, you have indoor plumbing, your body's working like it's supposed to. This is something to be grateful for and venerated just as much, if not more, than, the Buddha who's on your altar. So practicing with him, also practicing with Venerable Xing Fa, who is a Chan Buddhist teacher um, at Cloudwater Indo, the Zen Center of Cleveland. So practicing in these various traditions has taught me how to integrate my practice with my daily life. And that's really the focus of the book, is how to take the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and bring them into the boardroom, into family dinners, into, whatever you're happening to do at that moment.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you so much for that story. And one of the things that I really want to dig into with that is it seemed that there was a bit of a change of direction.
Yes.
That it started out with this, one thing or the other, and that's it. Thinking of, I can either be in the householder life or I can be in the monastic life, and that you, for a time, did remove yourself from the householder life, and still that cognitive dissonance was there, and you ended up returning to it and finding something else that worked a little more for you. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that. What did you learn from your time of relinquishing, and what was kind of missing for you in that?
Sure. Well, I think, doing that practice and, sharing an unheated bunkhouse with 5 other people and, working outside when it's 30 degrees and, snowing, but, we're building this tiny house and it needs to be done by spring. So we're out here till it's done. Having those types of experiences, it taught me that suffering is everywhere. I think I most definitely had the grass is greener approach to life. This idea that, well, the householder life isn't working for me, so let me give up everything householder like, and then things will improve. And what I found was that, suffering is everywhere. We can't escape it. It changes, right? There's suffering when your boss doesn't like your project. There's suffering when you have to work in the rain. So the practice isn't so much escaping suffering, but learning to really live with it. And I think at that point, my thought was I could just get rid of everything that caused me suffering. And what I learned was there's always something else. So that lesson was very important, but also something that, and I'm still moving deeper into this understanding, but just realizing that the same veneration and the same respect that I can have when I'm sweeping the floors at the temple or when I'm sitting in meditation at a retreat, I can have that same mindset and that same respect when I'm sitting in my office cubicle or when I'm washing dishes. It's not really the outside stuff that changes. It's my mind that changes. So that was a really big change for me, just realizing that, suffering comes from my mind. So if I want to deal with suffering, I need to deal with my mind. And everything else will just kind of be what it is.
Interesting. And thank you for sharing that story. And it's one that I've heard many times before from those who've gone into a monastic life, and I'll say in some ways hopeful and reasonably so, that by relinquishing the stuff, that closes some of the doors and pathways that suffering has towards us. And so that's a reasonable thing to expect, and then getting into it and realizing that that stuff about the clinging part, it's not about the stuff, it's about us.
About us.
We may be clinging whether we're out in a world where there's not a lot of material stuff for us to cling to, but the clinging is still as strong as ever because it's still us, and how to work with that. So thank you very much for that exposition about it. And I want to shift a little bit towards your book. And I'm curious about that because as I mentioned, you have the blog, and did the book come from the blog or some other source? What was the genesis of it?
Oh, that's good. It's a good question. So my blog is The Same Old Zen. And originally that was not meant to be a blog about Buddhism. I had, given away all my possessions, my car, my paintings, everything was gone. And my family, frankly, was very worried about me, understandably so. This very drastic change that I was making. They did not like the fact that I was going to be working unpaid on a farm, no less. So I originally started writing as kind of a way to keep in contact with them and just really sort of put into words why I was doing this, what I was hoping to accomplish. And it's just sort of grew over time into a blog about Buddhism because Buddhism has become such an integral part of my life where it really does in in fact every decision I make, every interaction I have, I'm thinking, well, what would the Buddha do in this situation? What's the teaching of right speech or right action or right livelihood, and how does that apply to this scenario? So a lot of the writing that I do at the Same Old Zen, it's teaching, but it's also, confessing and just really, this is what I'm struggling with right now. And when I went to the sutras or when I went to a Dharma book to find an answer, this is what I found. Maybe it'll work for you. And that's kind of been my practice over the years. So the blog is a part of my spiritual practice in my own mind. And then how the book kind of grew out of that is that as I was reading, these various Dharma books, which were fantastic, is that they all kind of fit into that exact same dichotomy that I had when I first started practicing of, well, it's either clearly geared towards people who want to go the monastic route, or it's people who aren't really that interested in, who see Buddhism more as like a hobby than something they really want to devote themselves to.
Yeah.
And there was not really that in between of, I want to practice Buddhism, but I want to have a job while I do it. I want to practice Buddhism, but I have 3 kids and I can't leave to go on retreat for, 3 months. And I just didn't see that group of people being spoken to. And being one of those people, I felt the need to write something that would speak to that audience, the people who really this practice is important to them, but who really need a little bit more of a nudge into how the practice can work in the daily, everyday struggle that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to view that in our contemporary society, it may be a little more challenging and not acceptable. And I don't think it, from my perspective, as part of that, should be acceptable to abandon one's family. We're not all in the position of Gautama, having if not a prince, just being well-to-do enough that we can leave.
Sure.
And take off and know that the Rahula, our child, is going to be taken care of, our wife is going to be taken care of in this fairly affluent context. We can't all do that.
Absolutely.
And wanting the Sasana and Buddhism to be part of our lives, a deeply transformative part of our lives, not just furnishings or decorations we have around our house, but something that we actually do and live within that household of life. So thank you for that. And in the subtitle of your book, the part that stood out for me, because of the secular Buddhism, it's the same kind of approach. This is for people, and it's about how we live our lives. You put in there for everyday life. And I'm wondering if you might say a little bit more about what that means to you, why that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title of the book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life, it actually came from an experience I had while I was on retreat with Venerable Shi Fa, and we were doing a kinhin, or walking meditation, outside the cabin where we were having the retreat. And as we're walking, it's cold outside. There's frost on the ground, lots of dead leaves. It's winter. And as we're walking, kind of focusing on my breath, trying to pay attention. And I just had this really wonderful opening experience where everything just kind of became high definition. Right. So and I say in the book that the trees weren't just brown, like they were brown. Like this is what you think of when you think of brown, but not even just that, but then looking at the trees and seeing like there's different shades of brown here. And looking at the leaves and noticing like this isn't just an orange leaf. There's all these veins and there's different textures. And I've seen trees before and I've seen leaves before, obviously, but seeing it like that and understanding that this really is perfect and beautiful and worthy of my attention. And it's still just a dead leaf on the ground. Like both are true at the same time. And I think that we, especially as Westerners, can forget that lesson just because everything has to be bigger, flashier, better, and just not realizing that ordinary life, if we're willing to look at it closely, can be incredibly powerful. Right. So I always use the example of going into the restaurant and eating a meal. And we kind of brush that off. But if you really take the time to think about what goes into you getting that meal and all the people who cooked the food and the farmer who grew it and the truck driver who brought it to the store and who built the table and the chair you're sitting on, there are just so many different things that have to come together for us to have these perfectly ordinary experiences. And seeing the miracle in that, for me, has been really powerful. And my goal with the book is really to help other people see that same miracle. Maybe it's on a leaf, maybe it's their cat playing with a toy they bought, or maybe it's looking at the lake by their house, but really just helping people see. Yes.
Those who are listening and are wondering, on camera right now during the interview, I just held up a leaf that I have nearby as a reminder of exactly the kind of experience that Alex is discussing, that there is this perfection in the ordinary that we often miss.
Yes, we do. But Buddhism can help us see it.
What's your favorite part of the book, knowing that there might be lots of different things that you like about it, I would imagine, in being your book? Is there one or two maybe particular things that I'm really glad that's in there?
Yeah. So there's one essay that I feel really, really great about. And it really epitomizes not only what I was just talking about, but really what my practice looks like. And it's called How We Say I Love You in Buddhism. And it's essentially talking about the stuff that I think as Westerners we do grudgingly. When we go into the temple, the offerings, the bowing, the incense, things like that. And first off, just explain why that's important. So with the bowing, for example, when we do a full prostration, put our head to the floor, we're making ourselves smaller. It's an act of humility, an act of reverence. And we're reminding ourselves physically that we're not the center of the universe for that moment. We're letting the world be bigger than we are. But then we're realizing that it's okay. We can do that. We can be vulnerable and the temple's not going to fall down on us. We can be on the ground and no one's going to kick us. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable that way, then our eyes open up and we're able to see various things. And we're able to see that not only is our practice a way of saying, I love you to the world, but the world says, I love you to us in so many different ways, right? So, our car starting when we get up in the morning, water coming out of the faucet so we can make our tea or our coffee. That's an I love you from the mechanic who worked on the car. That's an I love you from the plumber who works on our pipes, right? So love in Buddhism really it's a verb, it's an action. It's not an intellectual feeling. It's what we do for the world and also what the world does for us. So in that essay, I just explain all the different ways that we say I love you through our practice. And then also the flip side, how the world says I love you back.
So I also wanted to ask about what your experience has been in some areas where our own community director occasionally runs into pushbacks as an African American steeped
Mhm.
in non-heritage, in this case, secular Buddhism. And I'm just wondering if you're willing to share anything of your experiences, whatever they may have been, about
Mhm.
being an African American in a particular tradition where you might not see many African Americans.
Sure, sure. It's very interesting because one of the things I learned very quickly and that I just had to kind of learn to work with and accept is I had this very Pollyanna view of Buddhists and of Buddhism that, you know, all Buddhists are by their nature these fully realized, fully enlightened beings, and we only speak to each other with kindness and respect. And um,
I'm
I
so sorry, that's not how it actually plays out.
yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially I found on the internet, just because someone calls themselves Buddhist doesn't necessarily mean they behave in a way that's in keeping with the teachings. And I've just had some really interesting experiences of having pushback, similar to what Jennifer describes in her own life, of people questioning why I'm here. Who taught you? Just really having to kind of justify my existence, which has been tough. And then also seeing this idea that um, Westerners seem to have this idea that minorities just don't belong in Buddhist centers or that we're not interested in Buddhism. I remember one conversation in particular where a Dharma teacher told me completely unironically that he just doesn't think minorities are interested in Buddhism. And this is on Facebook, so you can see my profile picture, and it's like I'm a Black Buddhist teacher, so where are you getting this idea from? And then of course that erases all the Asian people
Right.
from Japan, Korea, Tibet, Nepal, Southeast Asia, etc., who brought these practices here. And just to have incidents like that, or this idea that only white people are interested in these practices in the West, um, has been an eye-opening experience. One of the things that kind of helped me cope with that, I had the really great honor and privilege of taking part in a retreat recently. It was called The Gathering, and it was held at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in California. And it was it was powerful. The organizers were Reverend Angel Kyoto, Bishop Miyoke, Conda Mason, and Noliwe. Of course, now I can't remember Noliwe's last name. I apologize. But they put this event together, and it was just incredible. And the idea was that all these, Black Buddhist teachers who supposedly don't exist, according to this one individual, can get together and network and talk and practice with one another. And they talked about some of their struggles. Some of the elders who were there, Reverend Earthland Manuel, for example, and just how they had to walk into these Dharma centers being the only person of color. Yeah. And, dealing with all that fear, this is back in the 60s, right? So dealing with that fear and just being willing to say, I love the Dharma more than I'm afraid, and just being willing to practice with that discomfort. And I've just kind of accepted that that's going to have to be part of my practice as well. Frankly, not to the extent that they dealt with, but just being willing to sit with the discomfort of being a Black Buddhist teacher and understanding that some people are going to be suspicious of that. I guess, we're still in samsara regardless. So that's just become part of my practice, is learning to deal with that when it comes up and learning to integrate that. I can learn what to do from people, and I can also learn what not to do as well. So that's a lesson I take from those instances.
Thank you for that. And I think that you're right in the experiences. It sounds like we're shared there as that things are changing. Doesn't mean they don't have a long way to go, and doesn't mean there isn't going to be maturity on how just people in general understand and approach some of the challenges that are different. That
Mhm.
innovation is a thing, and it's here to stay. And people will find what touches them deeply that might seem a little odd, but really fits for them and is helpful in their own transformation. And that's not a bad or wrong thing. It's something to be welcomed as part of the strength of.
Mhm.
Alex, what else would you like to share with listeners? Anything you can think of that just to encourage folks, or what you're hoping they might maybe get out of the book?
Sure, sure. Well, I think the main thing that I'd like to communicate is a lot of times as householders, going back to this feeling of tension. So I'm an authorized Buddhist teacher, but I'm also a householder, right? So there is a tension there. And I think anytime we feel tension or discomfort, we think something's wrong. And I'm learning more and more that tension isn't necessarily a bad thing. There is a such thing as healthy tension. Just like when you work out, if you push yourself just enough, you get better.
EU stress is a positive form, like exercise is a perfect example of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times when people are householders, they have this idea that their practice is somehow less than or not as good as someone who spent 10 years in Japan or who lives in a monastery. And the one thing I'd really like to convey during this interview, but also what I try to convey in the book, is that our practice is just as important and just as holy as anyone else's. And the focus of our practice should be seeing how holy it really is, our everyday life, as opposed to wishing we could do something else or thinking that we should be doing something else.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. And for those who are listening, I will have a link to Alex's blogspot, sameoldzen.blogspot.com. There'll be a link to that on the episode page, along with a link to his book. Our guest today, Alex Kakuyo. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.